Hello, class, and welcome to Lesson 8 on genre. This is Lecture 1 on genre recognition. And here in our first slide, we have a still from WALL-E, Pixar's film from 2008. And if we were to recognize the genre of WALL-E, we would first of all say that it's an animated film. Although we could argue that animation is not strictly a genre, it's a form or format because animated films feature many different genres, such as science fiction here in WALL-E. We might also call WALL-E a romance or a love story. We could also perhaps put WALL-E in the category of adventure film. So one of the things that we're going to learn about genre is how malleable it is and how porous genre borders are. The word genre is originally French, and it simply means kind or type. And it's actually related to the word genus, which is used in the biological sciences to classify groups of plants and animals. Again, our classifications won't be quite as scientific, but genre is still very useful as a categorizing principle, as we will see throughout these lectures. So when we speak of film genres, we're indicating certain types of movies at the very basic, right, as we talked about in the first slide. Sci-fi, action, comedy, romance, musical, western, war, spy. These are all among the most famous, the most well-known, and the most prominent genre. We might even put Bond into his own genre at this point because there's so many Bond movies and they follow such rigorous genre rules. But as we mentioned, genres are not an exact science. They're really only convenient terms that develop informally. Filmmakers, industry decision makers, critics, and viewers all contribute to creating genres. And they change over time. Because of this, defining genre boundaries can be tricky. So as Richard Maltby writes, genres are flexible, subject to constant process of change and adaptation. Generic boundaries can never be rigidly defined, and all generic groupings are susceptible to extensive subdivision. Oklahoma, for example, is both a Western and a musical, and it suggests that it should be excluded from either category on the grounds that it belongs, and the other would be to use genre categorization in a very reductive fashion. So if that's true, and it can be hard to classify films as genres, how do we do it? What does place a group of films in a genre? Well, the first thing can be its subject, right? Its basic subject or theme. A gangster film centers on large-scale urban crime. There's many films that we could place in that category, right? Goodfellas, The Godfather, New Jack City, right? The list goes on. Sci-fi film features technology beyond the reach of contemporary science. A Western is usually about life on some frontier. Horror films feature a monster that threatens humans, often as punishment for folly, for letting the radiation escape from the lab, or in 80s slasher movies, very puritanical decade was the 80s, teenagers were punished for having sex. And then sports films, right? One of the ways that we can recognize sports films is that they usually climax with a big game or match or fight. So subject and theme is one of the ways that we can place films in a genre. One of the most important functions of genre is marketing, to be able to use genres to market and sell films. We as viewers know what we like. We all have genre preferences, or at least most of us do. And in a sea of content, especially these days, we want to be able to quickly and easily figure out whether or not something might capture our interest. And so the genre elements are used to market. For example, in American Gangster, we can quickly see that through the poster, The stark black and white represents the clash of good and evil. We've got the fancy, wealthy gangster in a suit holding a gun. We know right away it's a crime movie, right? Firefly, spaceship. Immediately, we understand it's science fiction. So it helps us narrow down. Yet subject matter or theme is not so central to defining other genres. Musicals, for example, are chiefly recognizable by their manner of presentation rather than their content because musicals can be in any genre. They can be crime, like Chicago. They can be war, like South Pacific. They can be westerns, like we talked about with Oklahoma. Even horror, like Young Frankenstein on Broadway. So we recognize musicals by singing, by dancing, by characters breaking into song at the drop of a hat. Detective films are partly defined by their plot patterns, including the protagonist, right? So Blade Runner is a detective film, but it's also science fiction. So how do we recognize that it's a detective film? Well, it's got the genre of the gumshoe private eye, the hard-boiled noir character who's trying to solve a crime, right? Some genres are defined by the distinctive emotional effect they aim for. Amusement in comedies, tension in suspense films. That's why you'll often see so many different kinds of films lumped into thriller, right? If you go to HBO Max or Netflix or something. Although these streaming giants, with all their content, have gotten really specific about subdividing their genre categories further and further down to market to niche audiences. And the question of categorization is complicated, as we discussed, by the fact that genres can be more or less broad. We talked about thrillers, right? A thriller could be a horror film, it could be a cop movie, it could be a heist movie. Comedy. There's so many different kinds of comedies. There's romantic comedy and slapstick and farce and parody, satire, black comedy or dark comedy, teen comedy, gross out comedy, musical comedy, sex comedy, and so on. There's a lot, right? And they all have their very particular genre features. And of course, films often straddle several genres. In fact, I'd say that's more often the case today than not with Hollywood films, because Hollywood films are so expensive, they're trying to appeal to a number of different audiences simultaneously. So some examples here could be Groundhog Day. Is it a romantic comedy or a fantasy? Is Alien horror or science fiction? Of course, it's both. And then what about Being John Malkovich or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? But where genre mixing has really become a thing is in comic book movies, because comic book movies, and really all Hollywood blockbusters at this point, try to mix different genres. So if you look at a movie like Logan, it's mixed with a Western, right? Guardians of the Galaxy is Marvel, but it's science fiction, whereas, say, Ant-Man is more of a traditional family comedy. Then if you look at something like the Planet of the Apes movie, right? The second one is a straight war movie. The third one involves elements of a prison movie, right? So genre mixing keeps things fresh for audiences, so they'll keep coming back and seeing a lot of the same material over and over again. And as we discussed, genre categories affect industry officials' decisions about what films to make. And I think we all know that the films that get made in Hollywood today are comic book films, right? For the most part. Especially as major studios have made fewer and fewer movies each year and over the preceding decades. Their movies they've made fewer movies, and their movies have gotten bigger and more expensive, and they've been aimed at global conquest. 30 years ago, Hollywood studios would make dramas, right? They might make mid-budget thrillers. They made more comedies. Now, you don't get that as much. That material has moved to television or to independent cinema or to the movies that are made by streamers, Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu. And as we talked about, genre categories are shorthand for the media to characterize a film under discussion. Anytime you read a film review, that review is going to mention the genre or genres. I might discuss the way the genre is handled, especially if it's handled in a fresh way. Or the reviewer might say, well, this film was not very interesting, or it was felt stale because they didn't spin the genre, right? And then as we talked about, genre often provides a way of finding a film that viewers want to see quickly and easily. Many moviegoers are fans of a certain genre, and they may seek out films from that genre above others. And of course, genres can lead to subcultures, such as those that form around certain science fiction and comic book films. Star Trek is science fiction. Star Trek is melodrama. But Star Trek is also really, at this point, its own genre, because there's so much Star Trek material, right? So many shows, movies, books, comic books, video games, and all the stuff that goes on at conventions. So, if genres are based on a tacit agreement among filmmakers, reviewers, audiences, what gives those films their common identity? Well, those are called genre conventions. And those reappear in film after film. And one famous example would be swords in a samurai film. Other examples of genre convention: mystery films must contain an investigation. Revenge plot lines are very common in Westerns. The gangster film usually centers on the gangster's rise and fall as he struggles against police and rival gangs, and his own conscience, the objections of his family. And then biopics, we know they will contain major episodes in the main character's life, right? Real life episodes. That's why we go to see that genre, because we want to see dramatization of a real life. Other genre conventions are thematic. Hong Kong martial arts films celebrate loyalty and obedience. A standard theme in the gangster film is the price of success. The Western often emphasizes the loner status of the hero, whose individualism is both representative of the American spirit, but anathema to the community, right? Because you need the violence to protect the community, but the community doesn't want the violence inside of it. That's why you always see, or often you see, the protector, the Western protector, leaving at the end of the movie. Science fiction, often cautionary tales about what might happen to our world if we're not careful with technology, right? If we don't take care of it, if we let domestic surveillance get out of hand or whatever. And genre conventions also involve film techniques, something that's particularly important for our purposes because we've spent so much time identifying formal film elements and analyzing how they're used in movies. So in this case, we want to ask ourselves, how are they used to convey genre? Well, somber lighting might be indicative of a thriller or a horror film. Rapid cutting and slow motion violence might be representative of an action film. Poignant music in a melodrama. High contrast between light and shadows in film noir, or sweeping cinematography in an epic. right? So those formal conventions are just as important as the narrative conventions. And then iconography is another element. As a visual medium, cinema can define genres through conventional iconography. And that consists of reoccurring symbolic images that carry meaning from film to film. A Tommy gun in a gangster movie, swords and kimonos in a samurai film, spaceships in sci-fi, John Wayne in a western, or Kiss in a romantic comedy. And stars can be icons. John Wayne, as we said, was known for westerns. He was also, to a lesser extent, known for war movies. Bogart was known for adventure films and for hard-boiled detective films. Sidney Poitier was known for racial problem films, in which he played some kind of sterling, upright African-American character who had to face a bigoted society. Julia Roberts, especially early in her career, was known for romantic comedies. And of course, Jackie Chan is all but synonymous with Hong Kong martial arts cinema. So by knowing conventions, the viewer has a pathway into the film. And they allow the genre movie to communicate information quickly and economically. In other words, every time you see a movie, the filmmakers don't have to reinvent the wheel. If we're seeing a Western, we know what a Western town looks like and basically what it contains. So we don't have to get every detail presented to us in gratuitous fashion. We can just sort of see it quickly as a backdrop and get the idea. So it allows the filmmakers to get more quickly into the meat of their story. Alternately, a film can revise or reject conventions associated with genre, subvert them. 2001: A Space Odyssey, for example, is science fiction, but there's no action in it. There's no ray guns, right? And the ending is all but impenetrable, indecipherable. And that's the way Kubrick wanted it. The Bourne Supremacy is your standard action thriller until the end. Instead of Bourne, the hero, vanquishing the bad guy, he lets the bad guy live, and then he goes to the home of the daughter of somebody he killed in the past and apologizes for the murder. So it's subverting those conventions for particular dramatic effect. Little Miss Sunshine subverts the conventions of the family road movie, right? And we get all kinds of pain and heartache along the way. We get a dead family member. We see a lot of trauma, right? So it's playing with the conventions of the family film. So just to sum up, audiences expect the genre film to offer something familiar. They want all that stuff that they like, but they also demand fresh variations on it. The filmmaker may devise something mildly or radically different, but it will still be based on those conventions. The interplay of convention and innovation, familiarity, and novelty is central to the genre film. And you can see that in our film For the Lesson, The Invisible Man, because a lot of the basic elements of horror, thriller, and sci-fi are there, but it's geared specifically to the era of Me Too and the way that women are abused, harassed, exploited. So think about that while you're watching it, because you're also going to be writing about it.